Welcome back. You're watching Media Monitor on the SABC News channel. And just to give you an update, I know that we've been looking at the newspapers, but some of you, well, you rely on Twitter, don't you, or social media for your news updates. Let's take a look at what's on the front pages. In fact, what's trending on social media at the moment. And this is the list at the moment. Let's have a look. And you can see some of them are the usual suspects. Blessed Sunday, Sacred Space. That's all talks to a radio program that's on Metro in the mornings. And the top one, though, Hands Off Ndoro. Now, she's the lead vocalist in the Jerusalem song by Master KG. And it looks as if that she's being sidelined and being replaced. And a lot of people are just unhappy. So Dlamini says, come to think of it, her vocals made that song what it is today. Hands off Ndoro. And more tweets, pretty much the same kind of messages. I really hope that Ndoro is getting her royalties, because clearly she's not getting bookings. Yeah, there's this belief that she's being sidelined at the moment. And people are very, very concerned. It's a serious concern. We're not living in the early 90s where artists didn't know their rights. If Ndoro is unhappy, she must leave. Kogetso says, what does her contract and company say? Interesting. If gold was a person, that's hands off Ndoro. So she looks like she was the lead voice, of course, on that global phenomena, that song Jerusalem, and she's being sidelined, it sounds like, which is pretty sad. Now, we move on. All right, okay. Let's take, in fact, this next story that we are running now. It takes us to the big story of the Tembisa 10. The Tembisa 10, of course, Piet Rampedi was at the front of this, and it caused chaos and mayhem, didn't it? And a lot of people were concerned about whether these 10 babies actually existed. So the South African media industry reeling after Piet Rampedi's Pretoria News published a story about the birth of 10 babies. Now, this story has gained international interest after this was reported to be a world first and was meant to be in the Guinness Book of World Records. And various media outlets took to the story and ran with it as well. The South African journalist has been taking quite a lot of flack for not verifying facts before publishing the article. However, news outlets seem to have relied on witness statements without actually verifying what those witnesses or those sources were saying. And this has raised a number of questions about the practices of journalists over time. And so I spoke to Associate Professor Glenda Daniels about this, and I've put those questions to her. It's been an interesting time in South Africa, the birth or not birth of 10 babies. What has been fascinating, though, is how this story has been told. The Pretoria News journalist Piet Rampedi right at the front of it. But actually, so many news houses in the end ran with the story as well. And it looks as if they may not have checked the story independently themselves.
Absolutely, Peter. So the issue is not about, it's going beyond one journalist who did what he did, one editor, Pretoria newspaper. He didn't verify his facts because he didn't see the babies. And there were a whole lot of conflicting statements by the family. First, they were babies. Secondly, a second statement showed that there was no evidence of babies. And as you say, the issue now must be about the verification of facts by other outlets, other newspaper companies, other online journalists, other television stations. You can't just take a story and assume that because it was a front page story on one newspaper, that the story is factual, because you haven't had your evidence yourself. So, in fact, it wasn't just Pretoria News that printed the story. It was a whole lot of other newspapers in South Africa, including international stations that ran with the story because it's such a sensational story. It got clicks, clicks upon clicks, and the algorithms were going crazy. And it gets traction for news organizations that are struggling. And of course, we're in the era of social media where everyone suddenly wants to retweet something so they would also get more attention and comment on it. So this whole thing got out of hand without anyone actually having seen 10 babies. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, we have a woman who is probably extremely traumatized by being in the public space like this. We don't know what exactly her story is. We have a publisher that was rushing over to donate money. We have a crowd-sourced funding for this. We have psychologists, and now we have the Department of Health who says it wants to sue the newspaper, the company, which we have never had before, obviously. Which, if it happens, if they go ahead with their plan, is a sad loss for media freedom in this country. I hope that doesn't happen. I hope that the retraction happens, the correction happens, and a big unreserved apology happens. Firstly, to the consumers of media, in other words, the public, because we do journalism for the publics. And I say publics with an S because there's so many different kinds of public. It's not just one homogenous whole. That's the first thing. Then an apology to the health, the hospitals that were accused of covering up a scandal. Why would they want to in the first place? Why would they want to cover up the fact that 10 babies were born? And then an apology to other media colleagues, including, as I say, if the SABC also ran with the story, the SABC must also apologize that it ran with such a story without saying these are unverified. It's an unverified story, but we've heard from Pretoria News or wherever that this has happened, including ENCA that ran with the story, including 702. You know, there are just loads and loads of different people, different news outlets that ran with the story. So whoever did run with the story without saying this is an unverified story, they are also culpable.
So Piet Rampedi is the guy that perhaps is going to be the one to fall on his sword over this. But it does raise questions about journalism practice in South Africa over time. I've often tuned into overseas networks and they'll say, this is what we were told by this person, but we haven't been able to independently verify it. I've never heard that on South African media. And is this something that we should be saying much more? Because it will show that we have tried to verify this story. Or perhaps we should be doing more attribution, because this is something that, again, we tend not to do so much, it looks like.
Well, you know, even the overseas stories that say this has not yet been verified, I don't even like that actually, because even there, then I'm watching the news and I'm hearing this on CNN or BBC or Sky or whatever, and they say this is unverified. It immediately puts me on the alert. Should I have been watching this then if it's unverified? Indeed, you are correct. In South Africa, we don't even have that. In South Africa, what we do have, as everyone knows, or most people know, we have a press council system of self-regulation. And that's governed by a press code. Independent newspapers are not part of that, unfortunately. So in an analysis of those, the violations of the press code, the thing that comes up, it's been like that for the last 10 years, over and over again, there isn't the right to reply of the subjects. There isn't enough time given to write to replies. Now, this ties in very well with the issue of verification of facts. That's the number one in journalism. You need to verify your facts. You need to actually say, then your editor can trust you. I actually saw this. I actually was there. Rather than saying I relied on a WhatsApp or I relied on a statement or I relied on somebody at a hospital telling me this stuff. So this is quite a serious problem in South African journalism as a whole, not separate from any kind of other journalism in the world where journalism's under scrutiny in the age of information disorder, which is about misinformation, malinformation, malicious information, and because this is all coupled with the social media era, of course, where there's citizen journalism and people are participating because they can, and often participating with sensational news and news that's not verified or news that got passed on via a WhatsApp that 5G causes COVID, for example. You know, take the vaccine and this is what's going to happen to you. You know, all kinds of misinformation. And so the era that we're living in, the COVID era, is ripe for misinformation. It seems like this 10 baby story was part of what the author of the story said was a good news story, so people lapped it up. You know, miracles happen in only Mzansi. And so it's a miracle nation, as we know. So the world then lapped it up and said this is now going to be part of the Guinness Book of Records. So it goes to show how this was a very sensational story, quite an astonishing story. It goes to show how it's in the nature of the beast of the kind of era that we're living in, where news can be shared so quickly, and then it just takes legs, it grows legs of its own. The next thing, it's everywhere. The next thing, people who are talking about it are accused of being fake news people and people who are doing analysis of it, like myself, for instance. You know, so yes, Peter, it's actually it's you know I just hope that the whole story is just completely retracted and completely apologized for and completely, because it's very embarrassing. It's very embarrassing for journalism as a whole. Everyone gets tainted with the same brush. Um, and it's also, you know, for the you need public to trust journalism, because in mainstream journalism in particular, because how can you trust tweets? Because you don't know whether that's true or not. You know, people are mischievous out there.
Yeah, so one of the things, I mean, that's the story in the end. It was almost retweet journalism. But you teach journalism, and I'm curious as to what you teach your journalists about relying on sources, and how many independent checks must you get before you run with a story. We know that the Gupta emails and the Gupta leaks, there's thousands and thousands and thousands of these, but the journalists have only used the portions that they've been able to verify with other sources. And that seems to be what journalism should be. But it doesn't look like that always happens in South Africa. So what do you teach?
So, firstly, I don't teach journalism. I'm in media studies, which is a very theoretical department. And there's a separate journalism department at Wits, which does an honors course in journalism where they teach. Well, I also taught in that department at one stage. You teach that you need at least 3 different layers of verification. You verify, and then you verify, and then you verify. And then before your story is published, it has to go through to a sub-editor. As we know in South Africa, sub-editors have been slashed in newsrooms. You know, newsrooms are under-resourced at the moment due to cuts, retrenchments. It's a very sad state of affairs. So if a sub-editor, this is what we say to students, if a sub-editor thinks there are holes in the story, they should immediately raise the red flag and say, hold the story, let's double check. You don't need to print that story today. If it needs double checking for 3 weeks, do it until you have your facts right. Regarding what you're talking about with Gupta leaks, for instance, and redaction and only publishing what could be verified, that didn't take a few days or a few weeks. It took months and months, including months of having to protect whistleblowers. And in the end, as we see with the Zondo Commission, it's verifying what the journalists already said. All this was out in journalism. So, in other words, journalism did a fantastic job in South Africa by exposing all this, all the shenanigans, all the corruption, all the billions or trillions that left this country for Dubai, etc. If it wasn't for journalism, in fact, what's coming out at the Zondo Commission, it wouldn't have been that easy for, it's just like, it's almost like the second verification process that's coming out at Zondo. So we've been very lucky in South Africa to have a very strong investigative journalist culture that's done fantastic work. And, as I was saying yesterday, I think, the Reuters Institute, the Oxford Reuters Institute for Journalism has shown worldwide that trust in mainstream journalism has now increased. And this is corroborated with South Africa as well. So that's actually good news. It means people, whether in our country it's about seeing what's coming out at Zondo, that actually people who've been reading and consumers of news say, yes, but I read that about Translate already. I read that about Prasa already. I know that about the SAA already, and so forth, all the SOEs, ESCOM. So I mean, this one story hasn't made me give up hope for journalism at all. That's never going to happen. This is par for the course. This does happen. It's quite a big thing. It's quite embarrassing. It's not good for South Africa, etc. But it will never make me think that, oh gosh, this is the end of journalism. It just can't be. It's a learning moment for journalism. Go back to journalism 101. Basics. Check your facts before you publish. Don't rush to publish.
All right. So then perhaps as a final thought, we'll go back to where we started. So in a nutshell, whatever sanction, if what Piet Rampedi wrote is not true, whatever sanction that he faces, every media house that also wrote the story or ran with the story as fact must also face similar sanction. Is that what really should happen?
I don't know if you can say it quite as, quite as badly as that, because that is the practice here. It might not be the ideal and perfect practice that people run with other people's stories. But the onus is on the Pretoria News to retract and apologize first. And then, indeed, other media houses must also say, we shouldn't have done this, or we should have, we should have double-checked rather than just running with that story. But it can't be the same layer of sanctions for everybody, surely.
Associate Professor Glenda Daniels, thank you so much. Your insights always greatly appreciated. Thank you so much indeed for your time.
Thank you, Peter.
Welcome back. You're watching Media Monitor on the SABC News channel. Now, the Reuters Digital Report 2021 was published this week. The report in its 10th year shows that readers want trusted news in a time of global crisis. Now, the pandemic has helped rebuild some confidence lost in the media and pushed news companies even more towards digital, with print publications securing their journalism behind paywalls. However, all large media houses in South Africa have seen a decline in circulation and revenue over the past year. So for more on this, I'm now joined by Chris Roper, who's the Deputy Director for Code for Africa. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, Chris. Welcome to the program. I can't believe it's been a year already since we last spoke about the findings of last year's report. So I guess there's some patterns that have stayed the same through to this year.
There are, and there's some that have changed.
Yeah.
The one that has changed for the better is that trust in news is up in almost all of the 46 countries that the Reuters Institute looks at. It's grown on average by 6 percentage points in the wake of the COVID pandemic. So almost half of the total sample, so 44% of the people sampled are saying they trust most news most of the time. And that's, that global growth has been reflected in South Africa as well.
All right, so how do you go about compiling this information? How do you get to this report?
So Reuters has focus groups and survey groups in each different country, and each country has a different kind of demographic that can be surveyed. So you can't really compare, so for example, they did Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa for Africa. You can't really compare those three countries because they're different groups of people that are being surveyed. But just to get back to the trust in the news issue, it's quite interesting that South Africa is 12th on the list of 46 countries in terms of how much we trust the news in general. So Finland is the highest at 65%. America is the lowest at 29%, and we in South Africa are at 54%. So you can see we're still, and obviously this is pre-Tembisa 10. So who knows what's going to happen after that little intervention by independent media. But currently we're at 54% of South Africans surveyed trust the news in general, and in fact 57% of South Africans trust news brands that they use frequently.
All right. So have there been brands that have increased their trust levels in South Africa?
Yes, they have, and it's quite an interesting list of brand trust scores. So the past 2 years, News24 has been at the top. Now it was BBC News second, but it's always been really, really close. So currently the BBC and News24 are joint top with 83% of people surveyed saying they trust those brands. ENCA is third, SABC is fourth. So there's a lot of trust in the kind of major brands. The big movers, I think, have been the Mail and Guardian have moved up, and I think IOL have moved down a little bit to 65% trust. So these are trust scores that you can't just look at and say, look, these are trusted because they're trustworthy. Certainly you can of BBC News and News24, but a lot of it's also about how long the brands have been around and how well people know them.
All right. I mean, it sounds very much like normal branding processes. When you go to the shops and you want to buy toothpaste or something, you end up actually trusting brands more than thinking about what's in the toothpaste, because there's just so much out there that you now need to start to think, I've got to trust something. And the brands that have built trust over time tend to survive more.
Yeah, and that's why your previous conversation with Professor Daniels is so important. Once you've destroyed trust in news in general, you are damaging our democracy. And it's so easy to destroy a brand's credibility. I mean, Iqbal's survey at Piet Rampedi have done a really good job of doing that independent media organization. I mean, who's going to ever take the Pretoria News seriously after this mishap? And not just the mishap, because we all make mistakes, but their refusal to concede that they did something wrong. And misinformation is a massive problem in Africa and South Africa. And in fact, some of the Reuters stats around it are also pretty interesting. So the concern about misinformation is higher this year than it was last year, at 58% of people surveyed in the 46 countries are concerned about misinformation on average. That's the global average, 58%. In Africa, that percentage is at 74%. We're the continent that's most worried about misinformation. By contrast, in Europe, which is the continent that comes last on that list, only 54% of people are worried about misinformation. So, it's a massive issue in Africa and South Africa. And the more damage that's done to credibility of journalism. And in fact, the more damage that's done to journalism being credible, the worse it is for us.
All right, so an interesting take. Just now you talked about Piet Rampedi, Pretoria News, and their episode. Daily Maverick also had one though, didn't they? But their trust levels didn't get dented. Is it because they had so much goodwill in the bank already over a period of time?
No, I don't think so. I think what it is that they addressed the issue honestly, transparently, conceded mistakes, and showed how journalism is supposed to work. Right. So yes, they made the error, but then they said, well, this is the way it was supposed to work. And I think this is why trust in the media has grown over the last year or so in South Africa. It's because the media has been much, much more transparent about showing how journalism works. I mean, the strange thing is that a lot of people who consume newspapers, it's like your toothpaste example. We don't really know how toothpaste is made. We don't know the checks and balances. We just trust that Colgate, has those systems in place to make toothpaste safe. And it's the same with journalism. People haven't really thought about, I'm generalizing, but a lot of people haven't really thought about what makes journalism ethical, what makes it sound and professional. And because of these mistakes in the last few years, the few mistakes and the fact that we've shown and that media houses like Daily Maverick have shown this is how journalism works inside the machine. This is how that mistake happened. This is how we're going to stop it happening again. That's actually made people trust media more. It's kind of a strange paradox. If we hadn't had those high-profile mistakes, people would never possibly have interrogated that trust. And I think that trust is much more valuable now.
I suppose there's some positivity in that people in the continent are more circumspect about misinformation, because before we accepted a lot of things, didn't we? We just, if it was printed, it's almost as if we've been awakened.
Absolutely. I mean that's the great thing about the great and awful thing about social media is that it's, social media platforms and digital journalism, if you want to call it that, has allowed people who are invested in spreading disinformation and lies and propaganda a much better platform and way to do so. But at the same time, it's meant that we have this amazing fact-checking resource of citizens out there who are available to fight that misinformation as well. And I think on the whole, it's been positive, I think, for journalism. But in fact, another interesting stat is about who people are worried about telling lies and spreading misinformation about COVID. Right. These are the global stats. 29% of people surveyed are most concerned about politicians, and 16% about ordinary people, 15% about activists, 11% are concerned about journalists spreading misinformation, and 9% about foreign governments. Wow. So politicians are still winning that race, sadly for them.
Yeah, and not a big surprise, I guess. I am now fascinated as well about paywalls, because I know at the beginning of this journey, a lot of people just were not going to pay for a paywall to get through online, but they would buy a newspaper for some reason. But when it came to online, the story was different. Has that started to change?
So it's still quite nascent, and South Africa, in fact, is becoming a little bit of a success story when it comes to that, but a very little bit of a success story. So, globally, they looked at 20 countries where publishers have been actively pushing digital subscriptions. And in those 20 countries, and these are ones that are really been pushing them hard, like America, Scandinavian countries, only 17% say they've paid for some kind of online news in the last year, which is actually up by 2 percentage points from last year, but obviously it's a small climb. It is up 5 since 2016 though, so small but gradual climb. South Africa, we have a lot of what look like success stories. Daily Maverick, News 24, Arena, they all have pay platforms. Daily Maverick's doing really well with the kind of hybrid. News 24 is doing really well with their subscription platform, but it's still quite small, and it also has a couple of issues. The one issue is that globally, most people who are willing to pay for news digitally will only do so for one brand, as opposed to many, which means that you get one big brand that wins the race. And also, of course, access to news is so important for democracy that if you can't afford to pay for news, that's an issue. I mean, so a lot of the news that's carried on subscription-only sections of News 24, for example, is actually quite vital news that everybody really does need to see. So it's a kind of ambiguous situation at the moment.
And then I guess the model that Amabungane has in terms of donor funding, that's another way to keep journalism alive, because without it, investigative journalism just can't be done. It's so expensive.
Exactly. And I mean, Amabungane are entirely transparent about who those donors are, which is great. But at the same time, it would be great to live in a world where we didn't have to rely on donors, and where there was a kind of a more assured stream of income. And there's just a report has just come out about membership and news sustainability in the world, which Stili Haralambos of the Daily Maverick contributed to, which talks about how governments can contribute to keeping media alive in ways that don't involve government funding, but kind of like tax rebates and that kind of stuff. So it's an interesting area of discussion for sure.
I'm not sure if you've looked into this, but I'm curious about social media. So you've got brands, news brands, that are sitting alongside everybody and anybody. And does social media get looked at with the same brush, or are people also able to discern on social media, if I want to check a trend, I look for certain writers, certain tweeters to see if it's true or not true?
Yeah, so Reuters does look at social media. And just to be clear, my organization, Code for Africa, worked on the Nigerian and South Africa parts of the report. So when I speak for Reuters in general, it's because I read the report, not because I did the work. So interesting, the trust gap between news and social media has grown. So only 24% of people say they trust news in social media, which is 20 percentage points less than those who trust news in general at 44%. So certainly, I think what COVID has done is to make people mistrust social media more, because they can get the kind of authoritative information from news organizations. But obviously, social media is a place where a lot of misinformation plays out, and a lot of it is dark social as well, where we can't actually investigate it. And in South Africa, 3 of the top 6 platforms that we go to as South Africans are owned by Facebook. WhatsApp's 88% of us use WhatsApp, and 78% use Facebook. So it's a big issue. And the issue for journalism, just to speak to the question you asked, is that when 15 years ago, we thought we were cool because we got onto Twitter and Facebook fast. But obviously, young people don't use Twitter and Facebook. They use a whole bunch of other platforms like TikTok. And there's no way for journalists to become TikTok influencers, because it's just too compromising of the editorial code. So a lot of people are now getting their news from influencers on platforms like TikTok, where there's no oversight, and where we I think, this could be proven incorrect, but I think that reputable journalism organizations cannot actually compete for news eyeballs on those platforms. We have to stick to old technology like Twitter and Facebook. So that's going to be a problem as well.
Chris Roper, always a pleasure to talk to you. I'm hoping that it won't be another year before we talk to you again. But thanks so much indeed for your insights.
Good, and if I could just push the launch of our South Africa report. It's on the 30th of June at 3 p.m. We've got Reggie Malusi, the Executive Director of SANEF, and Wabisa Makungu, the Editor-in-Chief of the Sowetan. They're going to be on our panel, so please do join us. You can go to @Code for Africa, and you'll see all the details there when the launch is for next Wednesday.
Fantastic. Chris, we'll be tuned in. Thanks so much indeed. Okay, so it's been an incredible year, hasn't it, in terms of COVID-19. The numbers are going up and the third wave has hit us, and that has affected almost everything in all spheres of work and endeavour. And journalism has not been spared. In fact, there's even been calls that journalism are such important workforce that they should have been vaccinated alongside frontline workers. But here's a piece that we thought you might find interesting that takes a look at the difficult job of journalism during the times of COVID-19.
Keeping millions informed, that's the business of broadcasting. But telling these stories during a pandemic is risky business. When the COVID-19 pandemic struck, places of work were turned into ghost towns. But in the newsroom, the show must go on. From those grafting behind the scenes to those out in the field, human interaction is unavoidable. While most people went into isolation during lockdown, Promise Mashaba remained in the trenches at work. She contracted COVID-19 and spent a month in ICU.
I don't go out in the field, but I interact with people. I work in studio where we are forced to have personnel because everybody has a different function. So we have title operators and so on. So we sit morally next to each other. So it's quite difficult. We need protection because we need to broadcast the news to the people. Not only that, we send or we give information to the public.
In the first 2 matches of the knockout round on Saturday,
journalists have been on the front lines, and telling stories takes teamwork.
to go out there in the field, face the people hands-on, head-on, be there on the field physically. You can't do a story virtually. You can't be interviewing people always via Zoom or via other platforms that are virtual. You have to be there physically.
SABC as a whole, especially in line record, we work with journalists and camera person. When they go out on the field, they get to be exposed to a lot of people. So those people, they don't know their status. So when they finish shooting, they come back to line record or SABC to ingest. So we get contact with them.
I'm actually scared. I'm really scared because here at work we use the same machines, the same computers, the same edit suite, the same mics, the same everything. We have to sanitize every time, and you will never know the previous person who was using the computer did sanitize or what.
Fear amongst journalists has heightened over the recent spike in daily COVID infections. The South African National Editors Forum says it continues to engage the government on vaccinations for journalists.
As the South African National Editors Forum, we have been engaging with government for quite a while now about journalists being vaccinated. We were assured that journalists will be part of phase 2 of the vaccination program. Sadly, there has been no response from the government. There has been no plan that has been communicated with us following that engagement to say that this is what journalists need to be included in the different phases of vaccination. We continue to appeal to our government to consider journalists, given the critical role that they play in making sure that there is communication around the pandemic. Every time journalists are going out to tell the stories that are COVID related or many other stories, they are putting their lives at risk.
Media people, in particular journalists and broadcasters, are frontline people. They are essential services. We believe that they should have been vaccinated a long time ago. In fact, first of all, before anyone else, as they are frontline workers together with medical people. We know of quite a number of broadcasters and journalists that has already died as a result of the COVID-19 infection, and that is something that must be stopped immediately.
Other African countries have already vaccinated their members of the press. But in South Africa, media workers are still in limbo. The next in line to get their jabs are law enforcement workers and those over 50. Mahlako Komane, SABC News, Johannesburg.
All right, so that's just a snapshot of some of the challenges that journalists are facing during the times of COVID-19. All right, let's take a look at your newspapers now. Normally we do them at the top of the hour, but today we're doing them right now, just before we talk to our guest editor. So let's begin with the Sunday Times, and the front page there reads, "Tough choices as COVID swamps South Africa." This is President Cyril Ramaphosa is reported to be caught between a rock and a hard place ahead of tonight's nation address, which calls by health experts to introduce harsher restrictions in light of unprecedented surge in infections, whilst organised business has called on him to keep the economy open. The City Press is also leading with the pandemic as its front page story, saying that the state ignored COVID-19 advice. The paper is saying that the government was warned long before the third wave that a catastrophe loomed if restrictions were not tightened. The paper says that the vice chairperson and spokesperson of the South African Medical Association, Mvuyisi Mzukwa, said that government seemed to be solely relying on the advice from the members of the Ministerial Advisory Committee and ignoring other expert advice. The Sunday Independent is leading with how South Africa could be headed for stricter lockdown regulations, with President Ramaphosa expected to announce new restrictions following a spike in infections in the past few weeks, caused by what scientists have now confirmed is the Delta variant, which is spreading rapidly, especially in Gauteng, where there's been a surge in the number of deaths and hospitalizations. The Sunday Tribune says that thousands of rounds of ammunition, military-grade weapons, a jamming device, a radio frequency transmitter, raw diamonds and gold jewelry were among the items seized during a raid at a warehouse in Maryville in Durban this week. The Sunday World's front page headline reads, "Kill me if you can," says Lindiwe Sisulu, who's the Human Settlements Minister. The paper is reporting that the Water and Sanitation and Human Settlements Minister hired bodyguards for her former Minister of Social Development, Susan Shabang, who's reported to have raised serious concerns about her safety. Shabang is leading a high-level disciplinary committee established by Sisulu to investigate and criminally charge 166 companies, politicians and government officials who've been implicated in massive tender corruption in which billions of rands were stolen from the department. And the Weekend Argus on Sunday is leading with a story about the deadly Delta variant as well of COVID-19, and how this new coronavirus infections in South Africa appear to be dominated by this variant, which was first identified in India. All right, well, to take a look at these local papers and to discuss today's newspapers, I'm now joined by Siyabonga Mota, who's the producer at Wits Radio Academy and Citizen Justice Network. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. Quite an interesting array of stories, headlines. I guess, understandably, with the family meeting coming later this evening, that COVID-19 is a strong theme.
Good morning, Peter. Thank you so much for having me. Can you hear me?
Yes, carry on.
Yes, I'm looking at the Sunday Independent, where it talks about the Delta variant, which is being reported to be very deadly, and looking at the Gauteng province now being having so many numbers going up rapidly. Hospitals are full. There's not enough infrastructure for so many patients to be taken to hospitals, and obviously you're looking at we have a long history of having health facilities, but now if you compare the first wave and the second wave, there's a big difference when it comes to the numbers that are reported daily, and it changes how we have looked at things. And of course, the president has been caught in different places where now needs to deal with the pandemic, but also at the same time needs to deal with corruption allegations within government ministers. So the president tonight, we are looking at him talking about how is the government planning to, look into these matters, but looking at the recommendations of if the economy should be shut down, but also looking at the unemployment rate going up. So there's a serious issue when it comes to, or there's a serious complications when it comes to the decision that the president needs to take this evening.
Who would want to be the president, hey? Particularly during a pandemic such as this. Which other papers did you pick up on?
I picked up on the Sunday World, and I'll take from the words of Minister Sisulu, kill me if you can. Yeah, that's what she said. And we're looking at her hiring bodyguards for former Minister of Social Development, Susan Shabangu, who is chairing the committee that is investigating corruption allegations in the department. One thing that stood out for me was the allegations of Umngeni Water in KZN that is reported that there is another allegation of a business person who has captured the institution, Umngeni Water, and also captured the CEO. And if you're looking at that place around, the Umngeni Water supplies quite a number of district municipalities, including the Durban Metro. So that also looks into some of the issues that particular institution has in KZN. And some people have been reporting water issues. So maybe the revelations on when the investigations that were chaired by former Minister Shabang would unveil or reveal rather certain things that causes issues when it comes to water in KwaZulu-Natal, and particularly at the Durban Metro.
It's quite scary that she would suggest that there's threats on her life over this issue. I mean, it must be pretty serious amounts, and people who are scared to be revealed by this investigation.
Of course, because how many people are going to be, put in places of hide because of these investigations? And you're looking at, because we have so many investigations in South Africa, how many people are going to be put in special places, and how many ministers or government officials who are investigating or part of the investigations who will be given private security for their safety, because they fear for their safety. So this it shows that it's very deep. If you're looking at the report on the paper that some witnesses, their cars were tampered with when it comes to where their wills were spiked. So you check, you see so many things that are happening around this investigation, but it also tells you about some other investigations that are taking place in South Africa, the safety of those who are investigating.
All right, and perhaps time for just one more story that got your attention.
Oh, it's also from the Sunday Times.
Yeah.
President Ramaphosa, between a hard place and a rock. Well, it's not the first time. Yeah. But there are talks of banning the sale of alcohol, banning social gatherings, bringing tighter restrictions, particularly in the Gauteng province. But now, if you're putting tighter restrictions only in Gauteng, the virus is also growing in other parts of the province, but also of the country rather. But it also contradicts the federal states and social states, because if you put only Gauteng on hard lockdown, then in a way I think we are contradicting some of the founding ideologies of our constitution. Because remember that it's a unitary state. So whatever happens in one place must, happen in other places. But he's caught in a very, I'd say, awkward position, because if you close the economy, yes, you might save life, but once you've saved lives, those lives might still be under severe poverty issues. So he's in a very critical situation, but it's a situation whereby he needs to look into, get advice from different people, and not only on the ministerial advisory board, So he needs to look around and see ways on how we can combat the new Delta variant.
Yeah, it's interesting that this week Premier Makura in Gauteng has requested stricter measures, and he was talking about a hybrid that will take us quite close to level 5, even though level 5, he says, is a step too far. But if we go just below that, I mean, it could mean banning interprovincial travel, which might answer your question.
Yeah, I think also it's another thing that Gauteng is the economy hub. So if Gauteng is on tighter or close to level 5, that means the country and the southern I'd say the southern parts of Africa will suffer economy-wise. So it's a decision that needs to be it's a decision that needs to be looked closely.
Siyabonga, thank you so much indeed for joining us, and hopefully we'll catch up with you again soon. Thanks, my brother.
Thank you so much, Peter, for having me.
All right, and that's where we come to the end of this week's edition of Media Monitor. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, and as you wait to hear from the President a little bit later on, please take care of each other. Do all the protocols, but most importantly, do not leave home without one of these. Wear your masks. Goodbye.